Welcome to the ProfServ Traction Podcast, dedicated to exploring how professional services and technology businesses break through the ceiling. Here's your host, Steve Preda.
Hello, everyone. My name is Steve Preda, and this is the ProfServ Traction Podcast. I'm the host of this podcast, and today I have a distinguished guest, Matt Kark. Matt is the president and CEO of Corcentric. Corcentric is a fintech company that is helping companies purchase, pay, and get paid. Corcentric has been growing really fast. It was created as a result of a merger of Ameritech and Corcentric, the original Corcentric. Now they are called Corcentric. They employ 300 people in Philadelphia, primarily Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. area, but they are also in Europe, in the UK, France. So they are now expanding by leaps and bounds. And they just recently went through their latest private equity round, where they raised $80 million to fuel the expansion. So I'm very excited to have Matt on the call. And Matt, so welcome. Great to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Steve. It's my pleasure.
That's awesome to have you. So, tell me a little bit. Tell us a little bit about your origin story. So, how did you get there? You know, it must have been a long and winding road for you.
Yeah, very long and winding road that probably started when I was, really a child. I watched as I was growing up as a kid. I watched my dad, who I would, classify as a serial entrepreneur. So I watched him, in his many different business endeavors, whether it was starting companies. He at certain points had his own race car driving team and was a professional race car driver. So got a lot of different exposures to different experiences just from kind of, sitting there and being a sponge off of his experiences. And, I went to college and I had dreams of being a big broadcast journalism star and being a sportscaster. So there was a little bit of that, idea that I was going to do something totally different than my dad had done. And I know that, frustrated him that I wasn't going to study business or take that kind of more traditional path. But long story short, I got out of college. Things didn't fall the way I wanted them to fall from a broadcast journalism perspective. And on my own, ended up getting a job at a technology startup in the DC area. And that was really my first exposure to what that whole world was like. And, being that it was a startup, I was doing a little bit of everything. I was selling, I was project managing, I was managing developers. I was, pretty much doing everything from soup to nuts, customer support. And so I got a little taste of everything and really enjoyed that. And worked out that around that time, my dad's business, which you had mentioned before, Ameriquest, was primarily a group purchasing organization, but they had purchased an e-commerce technology platform that would help, scale the company and be able to manage the growth of transactions that were taking place within that GPO. And the company happened to be headquartered in Northern Virginia, happened to have some similarities to the startup that I was working at. And so my dad basically said, hey, I just bought this company. I know nothing about running a technology company. You've got more experience than I do, even though you don't have a ton of experience. And, I was brought into, again, another kind of startup environment where it was pretty much myself and a couple other people that were tasked with doing what we had to do to service the Ameriquest business, but then also given the opportunity to see if we could create something else on top of that in other endeavors. And that really is where the story started with Corcentric. Corcentric was the business that was acquired by Ameriquest, and from that point forward, really a long, probably 15-year plus journey of kind of building it brick by brick and continuing to figure out ways to expand the portfolio and the customer base.
Yeah, I mean, what fascinated me when we first met, which was around 3 years ago, when I spoke to your research group, you were still running Corcentric, and Corcentric was kind of the little sibling. So there were the two companies, Ameritech and Corcentric. Corcentric was the little one, and it ended up essentially like a reverse takeover. I don't know what to call it. It ended up being the name of the whole group.
Yeah.
So So my question is about how did that unfold, and what were the size differentials when you started? And the other question was, how old were you when you really get started? You must have been in your late 20s, right? When you started.
Yeah, so probably even earlier than that. It was probably like my early to mid 20s was when I came and started working in the Corcentric business and really taking that thing on. So very young, but felt like I also at times felt like I had a head start just again from growing up around my father and understanding how things work, and so I felt like I was maybe mature beyond my years, but still very young when that started. And really when the Corcentric business, when I got involved in the Corcentric business, it really had $0 of revenue outside of the Ameriquest customer relationship, which now was our parent company. So we had $0 of revenue really coming from any external entity. So we didn't really have any customers to speak of, and really no revenue to speak of. So it was really starting from ground zero from that perspective. And the business, the Ameriquest business, was probably in that $10 to $20 million range in terms of where they were at in their life cycle and their revenue growth. And that business continued to be what you would call a kind of steady growth business, single digits year over year revenue growth. And then when we really started to get the Ameriquest thing going, it took on more the shape of a successful technology growth story where we were growing 20, 30, 40% year over year. And so you could see how that gap would be closed. All of a sudden it would flip around and that become the major part of the business.
So when as I remember, around the merger time, you were about the same size, roughly the same size.
Yeah, about revenue contribution wise, it was probably about 50-50 split. So yeah.
So actually, the Corcentric was the growth brand in the group.
It was the growth engine to the beauty of bringing those businesses together was the Ameriquest business was steady. So in the early days when we weren't generating a lot of revenue, but it takes money to make money, right? We were still still needing to invest and spend money. We had the Ameriquest business as a backstop and really as an investment arm that allowed us to do what we had to do to build the business. And then we were able to kind of return the favor as we started to grow it and become this very high margin business that was throwing off a lot of EBITDA.
So you basically had a good visibility of what it looks like to run kind of a traditional business, the Maritech logistics and procurement type business, and then financial service. And then you had the Corcentric, which was a technology business. In your view, what is the major difference between running a technology-driven business to running a traditional non-tech business? And what are the specific challenges to that?
I think the biggest difference is just kind of the mentality of how the businesses in the different, in those different arenas are built, right? So in a traditional business, especially like a brick and mortar business, the expectation is like you have assets, but those, whatever those assets are costing you better be costing you less than the money that those assets are returning, right? So, profitability is probably way more important, way more magnified in a kind of traditional non-technology type business. With a tech company, there's this kind of, and it's become more and more prevalent, and I don't think it's necessarily a good thing, but there's this mentality where, making money isn't that important, especially early on, and you just do things at all costs, right? To whether it's sales and marketing or whatever you got to do to kind of get that revenue engine going and to get the growth figures that are looking at. So it's kind of growth at all costs versus, that kind of brick by brick measured, growth that, other businesses try to achieve. So I think, what was fortunate is kind of having that DNA of both sides of that coin, led us to kind of a balanced spot of understanding that, yes, you do have to make investments to grow the business, but do so responsibly, do so in an effort to still be profitable. We've been profitable every year since inception. So, striking that right balance answers the second part of your question, which is what's the most challenging, right? Is sitting there saying, okay, if we did spend more, if we did sacrifice EBITDA margin for growth, where's that right, where's that right line, right? Where's that right trade-off of, okay, we're going to invest more on the front end here. There might be a bigger picture more down the line return on that. And what's that right balance of profitability versus growth? That's a constant, push-pull kind of equation that you got to manage as you scale your business.
Yeah, that's definitely, and especially when you have to self-fund the business, then it becomes a bigger question.
Yeah. Yep.
How do you balance the stability of the company so that you don't run out of cash, but also, grow it as fast as you can so that other people don't have time to copy you, and that's got to be a really difficult the challenge to manage.
Totally.
So tell us a little bit more about that. I mean, give me some of the great successes that you had personally as an entrepreneur with Corcentric, and what have been some of the major challenges or setbacks that you managed to overcome.
Sure. I think from a success perspective, I truly believe every business needs kind of that cornerstone account, right? That flagship account that really takes you from kind of a thought and a concept and a dream to, okay, we've arrived and we've got some ability to really make something special here. And it's really trying to find what that cornerstone or flagship account's going to be. And then as an entrepreneur, it's an all hands on deck effort, right? And sometimes you got to, present yourself as a bigger company than you actually are, or you've got to, overcome some credibility concerns or scalability concerns that, you really don't have a lot of good answers for if you're just kind of getting started and, you don't have those things in your back pocket, whether it's, references or examples of exactly how you've done exactly what you're saying you're going to do for a larger customer. So really, I look back at, for us, that was, an engagement we landed with Daimler. It was a really large engagement where we kind of leveraged everything you got to do in a situation like that. It was, relationships, and it was, personal credibility, and just really an amazing story that would, probably be its own podcast of, it looked like it was dead and then it was not dead, and we never gave up and really managed at the end of the day to land that flagship account. So that was one, really proud moment, but probably prouder for me was, we would be nothing if we didn't execute, right? So it's one thing to land the account, to sign the account, to get the opportunity to do what it is you're trying to do, but then you got to execute. And, in terms of what that looked like and how we executed and the relative flawlessness with which we executed that particular engagement, and it was just really came from people, I keep saying individual acts of heroism on a daily basis, people just doing whatever they had to do, pulling all-nighters, working over a week, just doing everything we had to do as a team to pull that off. And, it gives you that confidence where you sit back, and once you've done that, you look and you say, God, if we can do that, there's nothing we can't do. And it just sets you on this trajectory from that perspective, just from a cultural and kind of mental perspective. But then also, the size of that opportunity and the revenue that it generated gave us so many more opportunities to do some things that, allowed us to, continue to make investments, to go to a board of directors and say, see, I told you so, there was something here. And so, it had so many different benefits, and it was such a milestone for probably me personally, but also for Corcentric as a company to be able to complete that full life cycle of landing that account, executing it, and then continuing to have that as a key important customer as we go forward here.
So that's fascinating. Matt, did you have some really difficult moments where you thought that this whole thing might go away, it might fall, you might become a failure, and your dad's gonna feel like you screwed up the business? And what was that like, and how did you come back from that?
It's a great question. I think, I've always told people, when people ask me like, what would you attribute some of the successes you've had to? And I said, and I've read this from other, business leaders and entrepreneurs, for me, probably one of the biggest driving forces is fear, fear of failure, fear of not achieving what I personally think I can achieve. And so, I don't typically tend to have a lot of moments of doubt. because I just know that fear is going to motivate me to go above and beyond and to be kind of relentless, to say like, I'm going to do everything I possibly can and run through a brick wall to make sure that, somehow we're going to make this work. So I never felt like there was going to be a moment of failure, because I have that fear combined with kind of some optimism that combines to create something pretty powerful. And it also serves to it really serves to ward off complacency. That's what I always say, is like, no matter how well things are going, I always have this thought in my head, like, okay, if I let the foot off the gas pedal at all, something's gonna not, work out well for us. So I think that's, more the feeling that I've had throughout my whole, career here.
Can you give me an example where this fear was particularly potent and where you were like really scared about a situation?
I think, I'll never forget the feeling of when we actually, going back to the Daimler example, when we actually got that business signed. My dad, was super excited. Our CFO was super excited. And I just remember sitting there being like this pit in my stomach, being like, oh my God, we actually have to do this, right? Like, once it becomes real, and really knowing like the success or the failure of this, again, it takes a team, but the success or the failure of that was going to be, mostly relying on in my lap. That was probably the most acute sense of fear, that I had, that I've ever felt, really. I'll be honest with you. I think I haven't had something since then that's been so kind of daunting and overwhelming to say, like, look, this is literally the difference between, success or failure. And not only that, but a, Fortune 500 manufacturer has entrusted us with, what we were doing for them was really kind of taking over the billing for all of their, in an outsourced fashion, for all of their, top 1,000 customers. So then you've got this, this Fortune 500 company that's entrusted us to take over a core business capability of theirs, and, just trying to go to sleep at night processing that is a little daunting.
a lot on the line. There must have been. I can only imagine. So
from the second part of your question was, some failures or some things that didn't go well. I think, if I could, if I could do it over again thing, I think investing in, the right sales leadership earlier on in our life cycle. So I think we held on to kind of that entrepreneurial mindset of like, using the term I used before, the kind of the, individual acts of heroism performed on a daily basis to sell. That probably lived on too long, and making that shift from kind of that entrepreneurial model to a model that's more built to scale. And that probably exists in other areas of the business, but it's felt most acutely in the sales arena, because that's really the tip of the spear, and without sales, nothing else really exists. And so I always tell people in smaller businesses, I say always, invest in good sales leadership, invest in sales methodologies and processes that are built to scale earlier than you think you have to, because it's tough to play catch up when you don't do that. And so that's something that I think, if I could do over again, I would do differently.
So switching gears here, when we first met, obviously it was Debbie Tyler's Vistage Group, which you were a member of, and just 2 weeks ago, I was interviewing Nick Beavers, who's also been a member of Debbie's group, and Vistage. Obviously, you've been Vistage for a few years, so you know what it means. We're a peer group, but more broadly, who have been your major mentors in your career, and what did you learn from them?
Yeah, there's no bigger mentor than my dad. And again, that happened really early on as a child. Just listening, just being a fly on the wall, listening to how he dealt with business situations, good, bad, people situations, financial situations. I gained so much knowledge. People always ask me, do you have your MBA? And I said, yeah, I have an MBA from DCU, Doug Clark University. And that was really, I learned more, I think, from just, again, being a fly on the wall, watching him, understanding what how decisions get made and the important stuff, right? Really the heart of the matter of running a business. And, you're not always going to make the right decisions, but you have your core values, you have your principles that you feel very strongly about. You have your own set of mentors that you kind of look for those foundational principles from. So he was first and foremost a mentor for me. I'd say expanding it outside of my dad, and a lot of what my dad stands for comes from these other individuals that I'm going to talk about. Big fan of Peter Drucker. So I've spent a lot of time studying and reading his materials. We are big Jim Collins people, so big on kind of good to great. And then probably more recently, very much, into a gentleman by the name of Ram Charan, who has spent time in the boardrooms and C-suites of a lot of really successful companies. And he has a way of taking very complex things and distilling them into very simple kind of concepts, and it kind of brings you back. Whenever I read his material, it always kind of takes me out of the weeds and brings me back above and says, okay, what's really important here, and distilling it into simple concepts. So those are some of the more bigger influences in terms of my philosophies and the way that I try to have the kind of foundational principles I try to have in terms of managing people, making decisions, the really important things that you do on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, well, we share some influences then, because Drucker is my number one hero as well in terms of management.
I didn't know that. Okay.
So going back to your father, I mean, do you remember a specific situation which really stuck with you, where you saw him struggle with a decision and how he got to it and how he made it and what he based the decision on and what happened?
Yeah, probably when I was just old enough to kind of understand what was going on, happened to be probably the low point of his whole, business career. So he had started a business. It was actually a truck leasing business in New Jersey. And, he just ran into some hard times. He had built a good business, had signed some really good accounts, and ran into some tough kind of macro conditions combined with, what was going on with the business. And, ended up not only being in a situation where the business was bankrupt, but it bankrupted us personally. And watching somebody in their lowest lows, and watching the integrity at which he went through that, how he kept his cool, how he just kind of not even going into it, I couldn't even imagine what he was feeling in terms of what it was meant to him personally, but more importantly to his family. He had young kids. We lived in a town that was pretty affluent, so it wasn't normal to be not successful in that environment. So just so much pressure, and to watch him manage through that. But I think more importantly, watching him coming out of that. This is a very accomplished guy in a lot of cases, but realized that coming out of that, he really had to chop wood and just deal with what's right in the here and now, and then watching the full kind of reclamation there of kind of going to work. He wasn't somebody that liked to, hadn't gone to work for somebody in a really long time, but had to go work for somebody in a smaller business and have a boss and
Wow.
do more of a kind of 9-to-5 thing. But he knew what he had to do for his family, and what he had to do to kind of get back to a position where he could then, take his next shot at an entrepreneurial endeavor. So that whole life cycle of watching, not just the business side of it, but the personal side of how he dealt with that, will be something that will stick with me for forever, really.
It's kind of hard to imagine him going through that, because I know him as an extremely conservative.
Right. Yeah. You only know him as
he has a lot of money in the bank, and to imagine that he did that is kind of mind-boggling.
Yeah. Yeah. But he also takes a lot of lessons from that, right? And even as we've entered these really tough times, right? The times we're all going through with the COVID-19 crisis and kind of the macroeconomics, it was kind of the dry. I remember when we were talking to our board of directors about, doing this deal we just did for getting the capital we just brought in. And there was points in time where it was like, oh, well, maybe we should just, wait and not do a deal right now. And, we don't necessarily need the cash to survive, but, and maybe it would be better conditions to get a deal done, kind of post-COVID. And he was so forceful with the board to say, like, we have no idea where this is going, right? And, he who has cash is king, and we need to get this capital in, even though we don't, have a, immediate dire need for it, but who knows, who knows what's going to happen. And, if capital markets dry up and this thing goes longer than people think it's going to go, we don't want to be sitting there saying, God, we had an opportunity to, to put some capital in the bank and we didn't. And so I know that's so informed by, the experiences he had, earlier in his career.
This is really cool. I like that story. So Matt, we met 3 years ago, and then you started implementing EOS 2.5 years ago. And I never asked you this question, but I really like to ask it to you now. That why did you find EOS, and how did you find EOS, and why did you decide to implement it?
Yeah, so I think I'm a pretty voracious reader, especially of business books. So I had read a lot of different books and different business ways to operate, business operating systems, and I always found myself saying when I would I found myself in a position where I knew we needed to shift from, again, kind of being truly purely entrepreneurial, where everything just kind of happens organically and there's no kind of rhyme or reason to it, to some semblance of a more structured, scalable, built for growth kind of situation. And as I read different, philosophies or business operating system models, I always came away saying, well, I could see myself implementing this piece or that piece, but the whole thing just doesn't seem realistic. It doesn't seem practical. It doesn't seem like something that, would stick. And then somebody had recommended, Traction to me. And when I read it, I was like, I got to the end of the book and I was like, wow. I was like, it's really simple, but it makes a ton of sense. It ties together a lot of the concepts of people that I respect a lot, like a Jim Collins, taking kind of, bits and pieces, there's some Drucker stuff in there. And so when I got through it, I said, I can actually see myself implementing this and I can see it sticking. And that's what was important to me. I didn't want to, introduce something in the organization, have everybody go through, a whole bunch of, change and then have it be something that dies out, a couple quarters later or a year later, and everybody's like, all right, on to the next thing. What's going to be the next, the next thing? So, that was, it hit all the notes for me in terms of, the simple concepts of, simplifying the business, accountability, operating off of kind of clear metrics, understanding who you are and what your target market. Those were all things that we really needed to get ourselves coalesced around. And then the way it was distilled in the book and then in the process, again, was something that I thought was, practical and something that could actually be implemented successfully, and more importantly, it could have, staying power.
What was very interesting when we started working on it was that you just merged the two organizations, Corcentric and Ameriquest. Yep. And you had a huge leadership team, actually, which was a big concern for me because we started with 18 people on the leadership team, which doesn't make implementation necessarily easier.
No, not at
all. But you go through it, and you actually, I remember you saying that you want to use EOS to make the merger more seamless. And I wonder what the thinking was behind it.
Yeah, so knowing that we were bringing together two different organizations, two disparate leadership teams that had operated in a very siloed fashion, I thought, some of the things that were most important, that continue to be so important from, the whole EOS model is, we got to get people speaking the same language, right? Like that's the first step in trying to bring people together. Like what's the language we're all going to use that we're going to know when somebody's saying something, what they're talking about. And so I thought, that was really important. I thought, breaking down these silos, creating an ability for people to interact on a regular basis, but interact where we're talking about the right things and the most important things was huge. So I really viewed it as a way to accelerate something that I think would have taken probably many more years to achieve had we not done it that way. If we not implemented EOS, I think it really accelerated was it perfect? No, but it certainly accelerated our ability to make that. It really amounted to an integration. It really amounted to a merger, even though we were working within the same kind of umbrella company for many years, it was people that hadn't really interacted on anything other than a surface level capacity up until then. And so it really accelerated things from that perspective and allowed us to get, positive momentum post kind of merging those groups together much faster.
Yeah. So looking at the US tool set, and you've been through most of the tools, if not all of them, which tools stand out for you as you feel are the most impactful for Concentric?
I think probably, the tools that have had the most impact on us are, the whole concept of rocks, right? That's been the most impactful, because I think as a, fast moving, very, aspirational organization, our biggest problem was, not knowing what to say no to, and saying, or saying the flip side, saying yes to everything. And everything was the most important thing, and everything was, the thing we needed to be prioritizing the most, and everything was the high priority. And, so just going through that process of setting rocks so that everybody knows, when push comes to shove, this is, what is most important is hugely impactful. And I think kind of, working bottom up from the whole kind of rock concept is, having that waterfall from, your longer term vision, to a more defined 3-year goal, to a more defined 1-year plan, to, what are you going to do this quarter, and being able to tie that, bottom up and top down, I think was huge, not just from an execution standpoint, but being able to take that out to the rest of the organization as we were growing, really fast. That was one thing we were finding, right, is that, at maybe the upper levels of the organization, we all knew where we're trying to go to, or maybe we thought we did, probably got a couple different answers even amongst the leadership team about, what we were trying to accomplish and what we were trying to do. But at least there was a decent understanding of, the big picture. But then as you got like every level down in the organization, there was less and less of an understanding of, where are we going? What are we doing? Why are we doing what we're doing? Why are we prioritizing what we're prioritizing? And so having that one kind of top down, bottom up way to kind of frame that whole thing up, and then using that to align, how different departments set their priorities is, something that makes it very efficient and, gets everybody, we're up to 500 employees now, gets everybody, aligned as quickly as possible, on a quarterly cadence, which is critical.
Do you feel that there is a point up to which EOS will support you, and there will be a point beyond which it will not be anymore sufficient?
I think the foundational principles are good, that they can scale probably pretty well, as we grow. I think there's some things you probably have to, think about or layer in as businesses get more complex, as you get larger, sometimes, I think when I look at EAS, I think the beauty of it is the simplicity. I think also some of that simplicity might have trouble, meeting the needs as businesses really get much larger and more complex. But I think the principles, around, the long-term vision, working backwards to your near-term goals, the concept of rocks, the concept of having, the cadence that you have on a weekly basis, on a quarterly basis, on an annual basis, those things are all critical no matter, what the size or complexity of a business is. I think there's probably just, things that, need to be either tweaked or modified to satisfy, maybe the needs of a larger organization.
Any tools that you feel specifically are missing from the arsenal that could add to the slate if they were EOS tools? Anything that you need to do outside of EOS because there's no tool for it?
No, off the top of my head, I can't think of anything. I mean, I think, I'd probably turn it around and say, the tools will work. The tools are all there. It's just, can you leverage all of them, right, effectively? And I think that's, that's the key is, how are you leveraging the tools? And so if I were to say that maybe there was a tool missing, I'd probably introspectively look and say, well, actually the tool's there. We're just not leveraging it correctly, or we're not leveraging it at all, right? So, so I think anything that I would say, is, and I'm sure you would call me on it too. You turn around and say, well, actually, if you use this tool the way it was intended to be used, it would solve for that exact situation. So, so that would be my.
The way you should be. It's my fault because I'm
Yeah.
yeah. Let's stop this conversation now. So you started at Corcentric. You started running Corcentric and you had no revenue 15 years ago. So if you knew then what you know now, what advice would you have given yourself to the young Matt Clark as to what you should pay attention to in growing Corcentric?
Yeah, I think it's, extension what I talked about when I was talking about the sales side of things earlier, and it really, not to be an EOS advertisement here, but honestly, like, anybody that I talk to that's got early stage companies, that's one of the first things I tell them to do. I say, I'll either give them a copy of Traction, or I'll tell them to go out and order a copy on Amazon. And I'll say, just read it and come back to me and tell me, what you think why you think you shouldn't put this in place right now. And it's very rare that somebody would come back to me. I don't think it's happened yet. I mean, people read it and they're like, wow, that makes total sense. And it all goes along the lines of, starting to implement something like that earlier than you think you have to. Because the earlier you start implementing it and you getting into that cadence, the simpler it is going to be for you to scale the business. I think that's a mistake that a lot of people make is, they, are heads down, and you got to be, your head's down, just kind of in the business. And then all of a sudden you turn around and you're like, oh my gosh, we're having success, but we're not built to support it going forward and built to scale. And so I think, implementing these kind of things earlier than you think you have to is the number one piece of advice I would give, because it just makes that ride a lot smoother. You're always going to have challenges. You're always going to have bumps in the road, but it really helps it. And then, it's very difficult to play catch up. It's really difficult to, once a business has kind of like spawned its own kind of, expansive reach, it's a lot harder to bring that back in than if you kind of, manage that as you grew on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, that's true. I always say that this is a low-hanging fruit for companies to implement.
Yeah.
It's something that is not very expensive. It is not very complicated, and it will improve things immeasurably. So why wait with it? There are some private equity companies that do this their 100-day plan. One of the steps is get them on EOS, and this is one less things that the private equity fund manager has to worry about, because they run themselves in a organized fashion, and then we just look at how to drive the business model from there.
Yep, absolutely.
Well, Matt, I really enjoyed our discussion. So if our listeners would like to learn more about Corcentric, about what you do, and they want to reach out to you, where do they find you?
Yeah, so websites, Corcentric.com, Corcentric.com. We're on LinkedIn. We're on all the social media, avenues there. So you can find us anywhere there. And certainly I would encourage folks to go and learn more. And, I'm always an open book and an open line of communication. So if folks want to, reach out to me directly, regardless of whether it's about what we talked about today or what Corcentric does, please don't hesitate.
So what's the best way to reach you directly? Do you have a Twitter account that people can hit you up on, or?
I don't. I think LinkedIn's probably the best way. That's how I try to get people to, I'm not hard to find on LinkedIn. And then if you shoot me a message, I can get back to you. So that's probably the best way to reach me.
Oh, that sounds excellent. So listen, I know that the football season is up in the air, and no way to attend Eagles games. How do you make up for that?
You know what? I keep telling everybody I'm somebody that tries to look for the positive in everything. So I've been spending. I usually travel 75% of the time, so I'm spending so much more time with my family, and that's that's something that I wouldn't trade for anything. So it's been great from that perspective, and I'm sure we'll get sick of each other eventually, but that hasn't happened yet, and we're just trying to have as much fun and enjoy each other's time and make the best of it as we possibly can. So.
Well, listen, Matt, I really enjoyed it. It was wonderful to talk to you. And this was the ProfServ Traction Podcast, episode. I don't know which episode is going to turn out to be, but check us out on all the major podcast engines, or go on tractionequity.com and you can listen to all the past episodes over there. Shoot me any questions that you like me to ask our listeners, and I'll make sure that we get that on. Or if you know someone, a professional service or technology entrepreneur that would be a good guest, then shoot me their name and I'll try to lure them into the show. So thank you for listening, and everyone have a great day.
This was the ProfServ Traction Podcast with Steve Preda. To learn how your professional services or technology business could break through the ceiling with EOS, visit tractionequity.com.